They turned my bedroom into storage before my husband's side of the bed was even cold. 3 weeks after Richard's funeral, I came home from a routine doctor's appointment carrying a paper bag with 2 prescriptions and a small loaf of sourdough bread I had picked up on the way back. It was just after 4 in the afternoon, and the house was unusually quiet. Daniel's SUV was in the driveway, which surprised me because he had told me he would be at work until 6. Claire's car was parked behind his. I remember standing in the foyer for a moment listening. No television. No voices. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and the old clock in the hallway marking each second as if nothing in my life had changed. I set my purse on the console table and started upstairs. Halfway up, I noticed a cardboard box sitting against the wall. Then another. Then 2 plastic storage bins with Christmas ribbons and artificial pine branches sticking out from under the lids. If you enjoy family betrayal stories, hidden wills, and mothers who finally receive justice, subscribe to EverNest Stories. More powerful stories are coming every day. I thought Daniel must have been clearing the attic. I was wrong. When I reached the 2nd floor, my bedroom door was open. I stopped before I even crossed the threshold. The king-size bed Richard and I had slept in for nearly 30 years was gone. The dresser had been moved. My reading chair was missing. In their place were stacked boxes, folded patio cushions, 2 old suitcases, a high chair Claire said she was saving for someday, and several plastic totes filled with decorations. Someone had leaned my mattress upright against the far wall of the garage, though I would not discover that until later. What I saw first was the handwritten label taped to my bedroom door. Storage. I stood there holding my pharmacy bag so tightly the paper handle cut into my fingers. Claire appeared behind me. "Oh good, you're home," she said, as if she had rearranged a pantry shelf. Daniel and I thought this made more sense. I turned and looked at her. More sense for whom? She gave me the patient smile she used whenever she thought I was being difficult. "You don't need such a big room anymore, Margaret. And the downstairs guest room is easier for you. No stairs at night. It's safer." Daniel came up behind her, avoiding my eyes. "Mom, it's temporary. We just needed space while we sort everything out." "Sort what out?" I asked. He cleared his throat. "The house. Dad's things. The estate. You know." Before I could answer, Rebecca stepped out of the hallway bathroom with a roll of packing tape in her hand. "Please don't make this into something bigger than it is," she said. "We're trying to help." That was the word they had all started using since Richard died. Help. They helped themselves to his desk drawers. They helped reorganize my kitchen. They helped decide which room I should sleep in. I walked past them and entered what had been my bedroom. Near the window, half buried beneath a box marked winter linens, I saw a wooden frame lying face down. I bent slowly and picked it up. It was our wedding photograph. Richard was 28 in that picture, nervous and handsome, wearing the dark suit his brother had lent him. I was 25, holding white roses and smiling like I had just been handed the whole future. Dust covered the glass. I wiped it clean with my sleeve. No one behind me said a word. I could feel them waiting for me to cry, argue, accuse them, or beg for the room back. Instead, I looked at the photograph, then at the word storage taped to the door and smiled. They mistook that smile for surrender. The next morning, before Daniel and Claire were awake, I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, opened an old address book Richard had kept in the desk downstairs, and called a number I had not used in nearly 2 years. The number belonged to Arthur Coleman, Richard's attorney, but before I tell you what he said, you need to understand why I had not called him sooner. For the last 6 months of Richard's life, everything in our house had revolved around keeping his days comfortable. Daniel started coming by more often during that time. First, I was grateful. He brought groceries, changed the furnace filter, and drove me to the pharmacy when I was too tired to go myself. Claire came with him sometimes, carrying casseroles in disposable pans and saying I should not have to worry about cooking. Rebecca called every evening. She asked whether I had slept, whether I needed anything, whether Richard had taken his medication. I thought grief had pulled us closer before it had even arrived. I wanted to believe that. After Richard passed, they kept coming. For the first week, I barely noticed what changed. Daniel took the spare key from the hook near the mudroom and said he would make copies so someone could always get in if I needed help. Claire reorganized the pantry because she said I should not have to reach the upper shelves. Rebecca sat beside me at the kitchen table and asked where Richard kept the insurance papers. Every question sounded practical. Every decision sounded temporary. That was how they did it. Nothing happened all at once. A drawer changed. A key disappeared. A stack of mail moved from my desk to Daniel's briefcase because he said he would handle it. One morning I found 3 boxes of Claire's things in the garage. She laughed and said they were only there until she cleared space at home. A few days later, Daniel started receiving business mail at my address. When I asked why, he said it was more convenient. I remember nodding because I was tired, and because arguing with your children feels ridiculous when they keep telling you they are helping. The trouble was, help had started to look a lot like permission. By the second week, Claire was choosing which of Richard's sweaters should be donated. Rebecca had made a list of furniture she thought the grandchildren might want someday. Daniel started talking about property taxes as if they were his responsibility. I listened to all of it in a haze. Richard's coffee mug was still beside the sink. His reading glasses were still on the end table. His jacket still hung in the hall closet. I had not even decided what to do with those things. Yet my children were already deciding what to do with the house around them. The morning I called Arthur, I sat with my coffee untouched until the steam disappeared. His receptionist answered first. When I gave my name there was a pause, then a click as she transferred me. Arthur came on the line almost immediately. His voice was calm and familiar. "Margaret," he said. "I was wondering when you would call." I looked toward the hallway, making sure no one was there. "Richard gave me your card," I said. "A long time ago." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "Did he tell you why?" I thought about the storage sign on my bedroom door. I thought about Daniel speaking of the estate as if I were already outside it. "No," I said. "But I think I am starting to understand." Arthur did not explain. Not yet. Instead, he asked whether Daniel had moved into the house, whether anyone had brought me papers to sign, and whether I still had access to Richard's desk. Then he said something that made me sit straighter in my chair. "Margaret, do not sign anything until you and I speak in person." I stared at my cold coffee. "Is something wrong?" Arthur took a breath. "That depends on what your children think belongs to them." Arthur's question stayed with me long after I ended the call. I did not confront anyone. I did not mention the appointment he asked me to schedule for later that week. I simply began paying attention. Once I did, small things stopped looking small. Daniel had started leaving his laptop open on the dining room table beside a folder labeled property expenses. Claire kept a measuring tape in the kitchen drawer and used it twice that afternoon, once along the wall beside the refrigerator and once near the breakfast nook. When I asked what she was measuring, she smiled and said, "Nothing important. Just thinking ahead." Rebecca arrived before dinner carrying a yellow legal pad. She sat at the kitchen island and began asking questions in the same gentle voice she had used since the funeral. Did I know how much the annual property tax was? Had Richard prepaid the homeowner's insurance? Was there still a balance on the home equity line? I answered only what I felt comfortable answering. That seemed to irritate her more than I expected. "Mom, we are trying to make this easier for you," she said. I looked at the legal pad. "Easier how?" She tapped her pen against the paper. "You should not have to manage all of this alone." There it was again. Manage. Help. Easier. Words that sounded kind until you noticed they were always followed by someone else making the decision. The next morning I found a business card on the kitchen counter from a real estate agent named Laura Mitchell. I turned it over. On the back, in Claire's handwriting, were 3 numbers and the words possible listing range. I placed the card exactly where I found it. That afternoon, a man I had never met walked through the kitchen carrying a tape measure and a tablet. Daniel introduced him as a contractor. "He is just giving us a rough idea of what a kitchen update might cost," Daniel said. "Us?" I asked. His face changed for half a second. "I mean you. For the house." The contractor looked from Daniel to me and seemed to understand that he had stepped into something he had not been told about. I smiled politely and told him I had not requested any work. He left 10 minutes later. Daniel waited until the front door closed. "Mom, you cannot keep everything frozen forever." I looked at him. "Richard has been gone 3 weeks." He looked down. "That is not what I meant." I knew. That was what made it worse. That evening, I went upstairs to retrieve a sweater from one of the boxes they had moved out of my room. On my way back down, I heard Claire and Daniel talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but the house carried sound through the old heating vents. I stopped in the hallway before they could see me. "Once the estate clears, we can finally start renovations," Claire said. Daniel answered, "Just do not push Mom too fast." There was a pause. Then Claire said almost casually, "She will not fight us." I stood very still, not because I was shocked. By then I was past shock. I was listening to my own children discuss my future like a project with a timeline. Daniel lowered his voice. "Rebecca thinks Mom will agree to a smaller place if we frame it the right way." Claire gave a soft laugh. "Of course she will. She does not need this much space." I looked toward the kitchen doorway but did not step through it. For the first time since Richard died, I understood the advantage of silence. They thought I was confused, tired, grieving, easy to guide. I turned around and walked back upstairs without making a sound. In the guest room they had chosen for me, I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened the drawer where I had placed Arthur Coleman's card. The appointment was 2 days away. Until then, I decided I would let them keep talking. 2 days later, before I left for Arthur Coleman's office, I opened Richard's desk for the first time since the funeral. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and the aftershave he had worn for more than 20 years. His reading glasses rested beside the lamp. A yellow pencil lay across a legal pad with 3 unfinished numbers written near the top. I almost closed the drawer again. Grief has a way of making ordinary objects feel heavier than furniture. Then I remembered something Richard had said 6 months before he died. We had been sitting at this same desk while rain tapped against the windows. He had looked tired that afternoon, but his mind was clear. He pulled a white envelope from the bottom drawer and slid it toward me. "Margaret, if the children ever start talking about this house as if you are already gone, call Arthur." I had frowned at him. Daniel and Rebecca would never do that. Richard did not argue. He only looked at me with that quiet expression he used when he had already thought something through. "I hope you are right." I had pushed the envelope back toward him. "You are worrying about nothing." He smiled, placed it inside the drawer, and changed the subject. Standing there now, I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were in the room. I searched beneath old tax folders, warranty papers, and a stack of birthday cards he had never thrown away. Near the back I found the envelope. My name was written across the front in Richard's handwriting. Inside was Arthur Coleman's business card and a single folded sheet of paper. There were only 9 words on it. "Before you sign anything, call Arthur and listen carefully." I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Richard had never been dramatic. He did not leave cryptic notes or make grand speeches. If he had written those words, he had written them for a reason. I slipped the card and note into my purse. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard Claire downstairs talking on the phone. She was discussing cabinet colors. White oak, soft gray, something called warm linen. I walked down slowly and found her at the kitchen island with 3 paint samples spread beside my coffee maker. "Thinking about changing things?" I asked. Claire covered the phone with her hand. "Just looking at options." "For my kitchen?" Her smile tightened. "For the future." I nodded. "The future seems very busy around here." Daniel entered from the garage carrying a box of files. "Mom, where are you going?" "I have an appointment." He glanced at my purse. "What kind of appointment?" I buttoned my coat. "One I made myself." Rebecca arrived just as I reached the front door. She had a large envelope tucked under her arm. "Perfect timing," she said. "I brought some papers we should go over later." I looked at the envelope. "What papers?" "Nothing urgent. Just estate things." Arthur's warning seemed to echo in my head. "Before you sign anything." I smiled at her. "Then they can wait." Rebecca blinked. Daniel looked at Claire. For the first time, the 3 of them seemed uncertain at the same moment. I stepped outside into the cold Ohio morning and closed the door behind me. Richard had spent 38 years telling me I worried too much about everyone else. Sitting in my car, with his note folded inside my purse, I began to wonder whether he had known something about our children that I had refused to see. Arthur Coleman's office was on the 4th floor of a brick building near downtown Columbus, the kind of place with dark wood doors, framed diplomas, and a receptionist who spoke softly without sounding unfriendly. I arrived 10 minutes early. Arthur came out himself to greet me. He had more gray in his hair than I remembered, but the same steady eyes. "Margaret," he said, taking my hand. "I am sorry about Richard." I thanked him, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then he led me into his office and closed the door. On his desk sat a blue folder. I recognized Richard's name on the tab. Arthur did not open it immediately. "Before we discuss anything," he said, "I need to know what has been happening at the house." I told him about the bedroom, the contractor, the real estate card, Rebecca's papers, Daniel receiving mail at my address, Claire discussing renovations. Arthur listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands. "Has Daniel moved in?" "No, not officially." "Has anyone asked you to sign a deed, power of attorney, listing agreement, or estate document?" "Not yet." "Do Daniel and Rebecca believe Richard owned the house by himself?" That question made me pause. "I think so." Arthur leaned back. "And do you?" I looked at him. "Richard handled most of the paperwork. I always thought of it as ours." "That is not quite the same thing." He opened the blue folder. Inside were copies of deeds, account statements, and documents with dates going back decades. Arthur placed one sheet in front of me but covered the lower half with his hand. "Richard came to see me about 18 months ago. He was concerned about how the estate might be handled after his death." My throat tightened. "Concerned about the children?" Arthur chose his words carefully. "Concerned about assumptions." I thought of Claire's paint samples spread across my kitchen counter. What assumptions? "That property belongs to whoever speaks about it first." I almost smiled. It sounded like something Richard would say. Arthur continued. "He wanted certain things made very clear. He also wanted you protected from pressure while you were grieving." I looked at the folder. "Protected how?" "I am not going to give you the entire answer today." Richard was specific about when some provisions should be disclosed. The formal reading is scheduled for next week, and he wanted the family present. That frustrated me more than I expected. "So I am supposed to go home and let them keep planning my life?" Arthur shook his head. "No." He slid a separate document across the desk. "You do not need their permission to remain in that house. You do not need their approval to control your personal belongings. And you should not sign anything they bring you." I read the first page slowly. Most of the language was legal, but one fact was clear enough. My name had been connected to that property much longer than Daniel or Rebecca seemed to understand. I looked up. "Does Richards will leave them the house?" Arthur's expression did not change. I think Richard wanted everyone to hear that answer together. I sat back. "Then tell me this. Am I in danger of losing my home?" Arthur looked directly at me. "No, Margaret." That single word changed the air in the room. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Arthur closed the folder. "Go home. Be polite. Say very little. And if anyone puts a document in front of you, call me before you touch a pen." I stood and slipped Richard's note back into my purse. At the door, Arthur added, "One more thing. Do not mistake their confidence for authority." On the drive home, the winter trees along Interstate 71 looked bare against the gray sky, but I felt strangely calm. For 3 weeks, everyone around me had been speaking as if my future had already been settled. Now I knew one thing they did not. Whatever they thought they were arranging, Richard had arranged something first. When I returned home, Claire's paint samples were gone, but the real estate card was still beside the fruit bowl. I left it there. Daniel was in the dining room with his laptop open, and Rebecca was sitting across from him with several sheets of paper spread between them. They both looked up when I walked in. "How was your appointment?" Daniel asked. "Fine," I said, taking off my coat. "What did the doctor say?" Rebecca asked. "It was not that kind of appointment." Neither of them answered. I carried my purse to the guest room and placed Richard's note in the bottom drawer beneath a stack of sweaters. Then I went back downstairs and made tea. For the next several days, I did exactly what Arthur had advised. I was polite. I said very little. And because I stopped interrupting, they became careless. Claire brought home a glossy brochure from a senior apartment community about 15 miles away. The cover showed smiling women drinking coffee beside a fireplace. She placed it next to my plate at breakfast. "This one is actually really nice," she said. "They have transportation activities, even a little garden area." I turned one page. "How thoughtful." Claire brightened, mistaking courtesy for interest. "Daniel and I could tour it with you this weekend. I will let you know." That afternoon, a contractor called the house asking to confirm measurements for the kitchen. I told him no work had been authorized. He apologized and said Daniel had requested an estimate. I wrote the date and time on a notepad and placed it in my purse. Rebecca became even more organized. She started a spreadsheet on her laptop listing furniture, artwork, tools, and household items. I saw it one evening when she left the screen open while answering her phone. There were 4 columns. Daniel, Rebecca, sell, donate. My name was nowhere on the page. I stood behind the chair long enough to read every line. Richard's walnut desk was assigned to Daniel. My mother's china cabinet was listed under sell. The silver tea service my aunt gave me on my wedding day was next to Rebecca's name. I did not touch the keyboard. I took out my phone, photographed the screen, and put the phone back in my pocket. When Rebecca returned, I was standing at the counter pouring coffee. "What are you working on?" I asked. She hesitated. "Just organizing things." "Whose things?" She gave a small laugh. "Mom, we are going to have to sort the house eventually." "Eventually," I repeated. "Yes, when everything is settled." I looked toward the dining room table. "And what did you put beside my name?" Rebecca's smile disappeared. "That is not what this is." "Of course." I carried my coffee into the living room. The next evening, Daniel brought a contractor back without warning. This one stood in my kitchen discussing cabinet removal and flooring while Claire compared samples under the overhead light. I waited until they finished talking. Then I said, "Before anyone schedules anything, I would like all decisions about this house to go through me." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom, nobody is trying to take over." "Good." I smiled. "Then that should be easy." Claire looked at Daniel and Daniel looked at Rebecca. For the first time they understood that I was paying attention. Later that night, I heard them talking in low voices behind the closed kitchen door. I did not move closer. I did not need to. Their confidence had already told me enough. Before bed, I opened my phone and looked at the photograph of Rebecca's spreadsheet. Then I photographed the senior living brochure, the contractor estimate left on the counter, and the real estate card. I created a folder and saved them all together. Arthur had told me not to mistake confidence for authority. My children had spent weeks acting as if those were the same thing. I decided to let them keep believing it until the reading of the will. The morning of the will reading, I woke before sunrise and lay still for a few minutes listening to the furnace come on downstairs. Richard used to wake before me on important days. He would make coffee too strong, read the newspaper at the kitchen table, and pretend not to be nervous about anything. I missed that version of the house. The quiet before everyone else started making decisions inside it. By 8 o'clock, Daniel was already dressed in a navy blazer. Claire wore cream slacks and carried a leather folder that looked expensive enough to suggest she expected paperwork worth keeping. Rebecca arrived 10 minutes later with her notebook tucked under one arm. No one asked whether I wanted to ride with them. I preferred it that way. Arthur Coleman's conference room was colder than his office and much brighter. A long polished table filled most of the room. Daniel and Claire sat together. Rebecca chose the chair across from them. I sat at the end nearest Arthur. He greeted everyone, offered coffee, then placed several folders in front of him. At first, the reading was almost ordinary. Richard had left Daniel an investment account that had been established years earlier. Rebecca received a comparable account. Each grandchild had money placed in an education trust. There were personal items too. Watches, tools, a collection of old records. Richard had been careful, fair even. Daniel relaxed little by little as Arthur spoke. Rebecca wrote numbers beside names. Claire leaned toward Daniel once and whispered something I could not hear. Then Arthur closed one folder and opened another. "Now we come to the residence on Hawthorne Ridge Drive," he said. The room changed. Not dramatically, just enough that everyone stopped moving. Daniel sat straighter. Rebecca put down her pen. Claire folded her hands on top of her folder. Arthur looked at me briefly before continuing. There appears to be some misunderstanding about how this property was owned. Daniel frowned. Dad owned the house. Arthur shook his head. Not by himself. He slid a copy of the original deed onto the table. My name appeared beside Richard's, dated more than 3 decades earlier. Arthur explained that the down payment had come partly from money I inherited from my parents, and that the house had been purchased under a joint ownership structure from the beginning. I watched Daniel read the page twice. Claire stopped smiling. Arthur continued. 18 months before Richard died, he had updated the ownership arrangement and transferred his remaining interests so that, upon his death, his share would pass directly to me. Not to the estate. Not to Daniel. Not to Rebecca. To me. Arthur then read the sentence Richard had insisted be included in the supporting documents. Upon my death, my wife, Margaret Elaine Whitmore, shall remain the sole and unrestricted owner of our residence and associated property. No one spoke. I could hear the wall clock behind me. Claire looked at Daniel first, then at Arthur. So the house is not part of what gets divided? Arthur answered calmly. Correct. Rebecca looked confused. At all. At all. Daniel rubbed his jaw. But Dad always handled everything. Arthur gave him a measured look. Handling paperwork is not the same as owning something alone. I lowered my eyes to the copy in front of me. My name had been there all along. That was the part that stayed with me. I had spent weeks feeling as if I were waiting to find out whether I could remain in my own home, while everyone else had been planning what to do with property that already belonged to me. Claire finally spoke. Her voice had lost its confidence. Margaret, I hope you know we were only trying to make things easier. I looked at her then. At Daniel, then at Rebecca. I thought about my bedroom door. The paint samples. The spreadsheet. The brochure. I did not answer. Arthur gathered the remaining papers and said there were a few final items to review. For the first time since Richard died, nobody at that table seemed interested in planning my future for me. Arthur finished the remaining paperwork, but I barely heard the last few details. My attention stayed on the copy of the deed in front of me, and the familiar shape of Richard's signature near the bottom. When the meeting ended, Daniel waited until Arthur left the conference room before speaking. Mom, this does not have to change anything between us. I looked at him. What exactly do you think has changed? He opened his mouth, then closed it. Claire stepped in quickly. Margaret, nobody was trying to take your home. We were thinking ahead because we care about you. Rebecca nodded. The spreadsheet was only planning. Nothing was final. I reached into my purse and placed my phone on the table. I opened the photograph of Rebecca's spreadsheet and turned the screen toward them. Then I showed them the senior apartment brochure Claire had left beside my breakfast plate. The real estate card. The contractor estimate. One picture after another. No accusations. No raised voice. Just a record of decisions made without me. You made plans for my home before any of you bothered to ask whether it was yours, I said. Rebecca looked down at her notebook. Claire crossed her arms. Daniel stared at the table. We thought Dad's estate would be divided, he finally said. You thought, I replied. That was the problem. The drive home was quiet. Daniel and Claire rode together. Rebecca followed in her own car. I arrived first and stood in the foyer for a moment, looking at the staircase. The house felt exactly the same as it had that morning, but I did not. When everyone came inside, I had 4 sheets of paper waiting on the dining room table. I handed one to Daniel, one to Claire, and one to Rebecca. The 4th was mine. What is this? Daniel asked. A list. It was simple. Every box had to be removed from my bedroom. My furniture had to be returned. The contractor appointment had to be canceled. Any mail sent to Daniel at my address had to be redirected. The spare keys had to come back to me. Claire read the page twice. You want all of this done immediately? By Sunday evening. Daniel looked at me as though he were waiting for the softer version of the sentence. It did not come. Mom, that is only a few days. Then you should start today. Rebecca picked up her coat. I never meant to make you feel pushed out. I looked at her. Intentions do not move furniture. People do. Her eyes filled with embarrassment, But I did not take the words back. Claire placed her paper on the table. And what about everything we have already done to help? I appreciate the groceries. I appreciate the rides. I appreciate anything that was actually help. The room went quiet. Daniel finally asked, "What about us staying here while we sort through Dad's things? You have your own home 12 miles away. So you want us gone? I want my house back." He nodded slowly. There was no argument after that. By Saturday morning, boxes were moving out of the bedroom. The Christmas decorations went to the basement. Claire's bins went into Daniel's SUV. Rebecca carried my mother's china cabinet key back to me without being asked. Late that afternoon, Daniel found the handwritten storage label still taped to the door. He peeled it off and held it in his hand. "Do you want me to throw this away?" I took it from him. "No." I folded it once and slipped it into my pocket. Some reminders are worth keeping. Especially the ones that show you exactly when you stopped letting other people decide where you belonged. By Sunday evening, the bedroom looked almost empty again. Susan Parker came over after lunch with 2 coffees and the kind of quiet company that asks for nothing. She had known Richard and me for more than 30 years, and when she saw the room, she did not make a speech about what my children had done. She simply set down her purse, rolled up her sleeves, and said, "Where do you want the bed?" We spent the afternoon putting the room back together, but not exactly as it had been before. That surprised me. For weeks I had believed I wanted everything restored to the way it was when Richard was alive. The same quilt, the same lamps, the same chair by the window. But standing there with the afternoon light crossing the floor, I realized I did not need to preserve the room like a museum. Richard was part of my life. He did not have to remain frozen inside it. I chose a new comforter in soft blue. I moved his reading chair closer to the window because that was where I liked to sit now. I packed away some of his clothes and kept others. His gray cardigan stayed on the back of the chair. His photograph stayed on the dresser. The wedding picture they had placed face down went back beside my bed, but this time I looked at it differently. I was not only looking at the woman I had been beside Richard. I was looking at myself before I had spent decades measuring my worth by how much I could do for everyone else. Daniel came by that evening alone. He stood in the doorway and looked around. "It looks good," he said. "Thank you." He shifted his weight. "I owe you an apology." I waited. He looked at the floor. I thought I was being practical. Maybe part of me thought if I took charge fast enough, I would not have to think about Dad being gone. I believed some of that. Not all of it. Grief explains many things, but it does not excuse every choice. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. He looked relieved, then uncertain. "Are we okay?" "We can be," I said. "But okay will have to mean something different now." Rebecca called the next day. Her apology was longer. Claire did not call for a week. When she finally did, she said she had been embarrassed. I told her embarrassment can be useful when it teaches you where a boundary is. She was quiet after that. I did not cut any of them out of my life. I also did not give them back the keys. Trust did not disappear forever, but neither did it return because someone said sorry. It would have to be rebuilt in smaller ways. Phone calls. Visits that were actually visits. Questions asked before decisions were made. Respect practiced when no inheritance was at stake. A few days later I found the old storage label in the pocket of my coat. I carried it upstairs and sat at Richard's desk with a black marker. On the blank side I wrote Margaret's room. I looked at the words for a long moment, then laughed softly and placed the label in the drawer. I did not tape it to the door. I did not need to. The house was quiet that evening, but for the first time since Richard died, the quiet did not feel like something had been taken from me. Felt like space. My children had acted as if I were already becoming part of the past. Richard's papers did not give me my life back. They reminded me that it was still mine. Subscribe to EverNest Stories for more emotional family betrayal stories, inheritance secrets, and mother's justice. And watch the next story on screen now.